The dust cloud on Clearwater Ranch stretched a mile wide, kicked up by 1,800 pounds of pure fury. Thunder, the black stallion, stood 17 hands high and had sent 12 seasoned cowboys to the hospital in just 3 weeks. His eyes burned with wild intelligence, and his hooves could crack a man's ribs with one strike. Ranch owner Jake Morrison was about to put the beast down when 8-year-old Tommy appeared at the corral fence. The boy had been living with his grandmother since his parents died, barely speaking to anyone. But Tommy possessed something the hardened ranchers didn't, a rare gift passed down through his Cherokee bloodline that allowed him to communicate with animals through touch and whisper. As thunder reared up, pawing the air with deadly precision, Tommy stepped forward. The entire town had gathered, expecting to witness another tragedy. What they saw instead would change everything they thought they knew about the quiet orphan boy. What secret did Tommy's grandmother hide about his family's ancient connection to wild horses? And could this gift save not just Thunder, but the struggling ranch itself? The morning had started like any other in the dusty town of Clearwater, Arizona. Jake Morrison stood at his kitchen window, watching the sun paint the desert mountains gold, when his foreman burst through the door without knocking. "Boss!" "Thunder's loose again," Pete gasped, his weathered face pale beneath his hat. "Broke through the reinforced fence like it was paper. He's in the main corral now, and Doc Henderson's already on his way for Jimmy Martinez. That stallion caught him with his shoulder." Jake's jaw tightened. 3 weeks ago, he'd made the biggest mistake of his ranching career by purchasing Thunder from a desperate horse trader passing through town. The man had claimed the stallion was spirited but trainable, conveniently leaving out that Thunder had never been successfully broken and had developed a deep hatred for humans that bordered on murderous. "Get my rifle," Jake said quietly, pulling on his boots. He'd put off this decision too long, hoping one of his cowboys could work a miracle. But 12 injuries later, including 2 broken bones and a concussion, he couldn't justify keeping the animal alive. Outside, a crowd had already gathered around the main corral. Thunder stood in the center, his black coat gleaming with sweat, nostrils flared wide as he surveyed the humans surrounding him. Every muscle in his massive frame was coiled tight, ready to explode into violence at the slightest provocation. "Easy now," called out Roy Hutchins, the ranch's most experienced horsebreaker. He'd been trying to get close to Thunder for 20 minutes, but every step forward sent the stallion into another rage-filled charge at the fence posts. Tommy Clearwater sat on the wooden fence 50 yards away, having followed his grandmother into town for her weekly grocery run. He'd been watching silently, his small hands gripping the weathered rails, when something inside him began to stir. It was the same feeling he got when he found injured birds or helped his grandmother's old dog through thunderstorms, a warmth that started in his chest and spread through his fingertips. "Stand back, everyone," Jake announced, raising his Winchester. The crowd fell silent except for a few whispered protests from the womenfolk. "I've given this horse every chance. Can't afford to lose any more good men." Tommy slipped down from the fence and began walking toward the corral. His worn sneakers made no sound in the dirt, and his slight frame moved with an odd grace that seemed to part the crowd without anyone really noticing. Thunder sensed him first. The stallion's head snapped toward the approaching boy, ears swiveling forward in curiosity rather than aggression. For the first time in 3 weeks, the horse stood completely still. "Hey now, kid, get back," Roy shouted when he finally spotted Tommy. The boy was already at the corral fence, one small hand extended toward Thunder's massive head. Jake spun around, his rifle still raised. "Tommy, no, get away from there." But something extraordinary was happening. Thunder took a tentative step toward the fence, then another. His wild eyes never left Tommy's face, and gradually the tension began to drain from his powerful frame. Tommy spoke then, so quietly that only Thunder could hear. The words weren't English. They came from somewhere deeper, older, passed down through generations of his Cherokee ancestors who had lived alongside wild horses long before fences and brands existed. The stallion's breathing slowed, his ears relaxed. And then, to the amazement of everyone watching, Thunder lowered his great head and gently touched his muzzle to Tommy's outstretched palm. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Jake slowly lowered his rifle, unable to believe what he was seeing. The most dangerous horse in 3 counties was nuzzling an 8-year-old boy like a gentle mare with her foal. Tommy's grandmother, Eva Clearwater, pushed through the crowd with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. She'd kept the family secret for 8 years, hoping it would never be necessary. But watching her grandson work the ancient magic, she knew the time for hiding was over. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Clearwater as Samuel walked toward the general store, his mother's shopping list crumpled in his pocket. The town bustled with its usual rhythm, merchants opening their shops, children playing in the dirt roads, and ranchers discussing the weather and cattle prices. But Samuel could feel something different in the air, a tension that made the horses tied to hitching posts stamp their feet nervously. He paused outside Murphy's feed store when he heard raised voices from within. Through the open doorway, he could see a group of men gathered around a table, their faces grim and animated. "Lost 3 more head last night," growled Jake Morrison, his weathered hands gripping his hat. "That devil horse came right through my fence like it was made of paper. My best breeding mare is gone." "Mine too," added Pete Wilson, spitting into a brass spittoon. "But it ain't just taking horses. Yesterday it charged my ranch hands for no reason. Could have killed young Tommy if he hadn't dove behind that water trough." Samuel stepped closer, drawn by an inexplicable pull to understand what they were discussing. The men's agitation created a discord that seemed to vibrate through the air, and he found himself unconsciously placing a calming hand on the neck of a nearby horse that had begun to whinny softly. "Something's got to be done," declared Frank Hutchins, the town's unofficial leader and owner of the largest ranch. "This stallion isn't just wild, it's supernatural. Never seen anything like it. Black as midnight, big as a draft horse, but moves like lightning. And those eyes—" He shuddered, "like looking into a thunderstorm." Old Pete nodded grimly. "My grandfather used to tell stories about horses like that. Said they were born from the wind and fire, impossible to break or kill, called them spirit horses." "Spirit horse or not," Morrison snapped, "it's costing us money and endangering lives. We need to organize a hunting party, get our best riflemen together and put an end to this." Samuel felt a sharp pang in his chest at those words, though he couldn't understand why. He'd never seen this mysterious stallion, yet the thought of harm coming to it made him feel physically sick. The sensation was so strong that he stumbled backward, accidentally bumping into a wooden barrel. The men looked up, noticing him for the first time. "What do you want, boy?" Morrison asked, not unkindly but with clear dismissal in his voice. I was just—" Samuel stammered, his cheeks burning. "Sorry to disturb you." He hurried away, but Frank Hutchins' voice followed him. "That's the Hartwell boy, isn't it? Strange kid. Always hanging around animals instead of people." Their laughter stung, but Samuel was used to it. What troubled him more was the violent plan he'd overheard. As he walked down the street, completing his mother's errands, his mind kept returning to their description of the black stallion. Something about it called to him, though he couldn't explain what or why. That evening, Samuel sat on the porch of his family's modest house on the outskirts of town, watching the sun sink behind the distant mountains. His father worked late at the bank most nights, and his mother was inside preparing dinner. The peaceful moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Frank Hutchins rode up on his chestnut mare, dismounting with the confident swagger of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Evening, Samuel," he said, tipping his hat. "Your father inside?" "No, sir. He's still at work." "Well, maybe you can help me then." Hutchins leaned against the porch railing. "We're putting together a group to track down this rogue stallion that's been terrorizing the ranches. Dangerous work, but we need all the help we can get." "You're what, 15 now? Old enough to handle a rifle?" Samuel's stomach clenched. I don't know much about hunting, sir. Time to learn." "We're meeting at dawn tomorrow at my ranch. Tell your father we could use him too, if he's willing." Hutchins remounted his horse. "This beast has already done enough damage. Can't let it continue." After Hutchins rode away, Samuel sat in the growing darkness, conflict churning within him. The practical part of his mind knew the men were right. A dangerous animal threatening the community had to be stopped. But deeper down, in a place he didn't fully understand, he felt connected to this wild stallion he'd never seen. As if summoned by his thoughts, a distant sound reached his ears, the thundering of hoofbeats across the plains, wild and free and magnificent. Samuel stood, his heart racing, and for just a moment he could have sworn he felt the wind change direction, carrying with it a scent of freedom and untamed power that made his soul ache with longing. Tomorrow would bring choices he wasn't sure he was ready to make. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street as Samuel walked toward the town square, his worn boots scuffing against the packed earth. Word had spread quickly about yesterday's encounter with the black stallion, and he could feel eyes following him from every storefront window and doorway. Whispered conversations died as he passed, replaced by the kind of heavy silence that made his skin crawl. At Miller's General Store, old Pete Henderson spat into the dirt and shook his head. "Boy's got rocks in his skull, thinking he can tame that devil horse," he muttered to anyone within earshot. Samuel kept his head down, pretending not to hear, but the words stung more than he cared to admit. The stallion had haunted his dreams all night. Not the terrifying beast everyone else saw, but something else entirely, a creature consumed by pain and rage, lashing out at a world that had shown it nothing but cruelty. In his sleep, Samuel had felt the animal's confusion, its desperate need to run free while being trapped by invisible chains of fear and memory. Doc Harrison emerged from his office just as Samuel passed, medical bag in hand. Heading out to check on Tom Bradley, the doctor said, falling into step beside him. "That horse put him in a bad way yesterday, broke 3 ribs and gave him a concussion that still got him seeing double." Samuel's stomach twisted. "Is he going to be all right?" "Eventually. But he won't be riding again any time soon, and his family depends on those cattle drives for their livelihood." Doc Harrison studied Samuel's face carefully. "You still thinking about going after that stallion?" Before Samuel could answer, the thunder of hoofbeats echoed from the far end of town. Both man and boy turned to see Mayor Whitfield leading a group of mounted men down Main Street. The mayor sat tall in his saddle, his silver-trimmed hat glinting in the sunlight, while behind him rode 6 of the most dangerous-looking men Samuel had ever seen. These weren't local ranchers or townspeople. Their clothes were trail-worn and dusty, their faces weathered by years of hard living. Gun belts hung low on their hips, and their eyes held the cold calculation of men who killed for money. Professional horse hunters, Samuel realized, with growing dread. The group reined in at the town square, and Mayor Whitfield dismounted with theatrical flourish. A small crowd began to gather, drawn by curiosity and the promise of spectacle. "Citizens of Millbrook," the mayor announced, his voice carrying across the square, "I've brought in specialists to deal with our 4-legged problem. These men have successfully captured or eliminated dangerous horses from Texas to Montana." The lead hunter, a gaunt man with a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, stepped forward. "Name's Colt Brennan," he said, his voice like gravel. "We've been tracking reports of this black stallion for weeks now. Heard he's been causing trouble across 3 counties. Samuel's blood ran cold. 3 counties. That meant the stallion had been running for far longer than anyone realized, pursued relentlessly by men like these. "What's your plan?" asked Frank Morrison, the blacksmith, wiping soot-stained hands on his leather apron. Brennan's smile was razor-thin. "We'll drive him into Dead Horse Canyon. Once he's trapped there, we put him down clean and quick. That horse is too dangerous to capture alive and too smart to let escape again." "Now hold on," Doc Harrison interjected, stepping forward. "Killing the animal should be a last resort. Maybe there's another way." "Doc's right," Samuel heard himself saying, his voice stronger than he felt. The entire crowd turned to stare at him, and he fought the urge to retreat. That horse isn't evil. He's just scared and angry. Given the right approach, maybe he could be helped instead of killed. Brennan's laugh was harsh and humorless. Boy, I've seen what that beast can do. 3 ranchers hospitalized in Colorado, a freight wagon destroyed in Kansas, and yesterday's mess right here in your town. That stallion's killed before, and he'll kill again if given the chance. The words hit Samuel like physical blows. Killed before. The pain he'd sensed in the stallion suddenly made terrible sense. Not just the horse's own suffering, but the weight of violence and death that followed in his wake. Tomorrow at dawn, Mayor Whitfield declared, "We ride out to finish this once and for all. I suggest everyone stay indoors until it's over." As the crowd began to disperse, Brennan approached Samuel directly. Up close, his pale blue eyes seemed to see right through him. "You got some connection to that horse, boy? Saw how you talked about him, almost like you know him personal." Samuel met the man's stare, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I just think every living thing deserves a chance." "Noble sentiment," Brennan said softly. "Just make sure your bleeding heart doesn't get you trampled to death. That stallion's run out of chances." The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty Main Street as Tommy made his way toward the general store, his bare feet silent against the worn wooden planks of the sidewalk. Word had spread quickly through Millbrook about the previous night's destruction, and clusters of townsfolk gathered in hushed conversations, their faces etched with worry and frustration. 3 more horses spooked clean through their corral gates, Mrs. Henderson was saying to the blacksmith, her voice tight with anxiety. "That devil stallion's got them all worked up into a frenzy." Tommy paused near the post office, pretending to examine a wanted poster while he listened. The ability that set him apart from everyone else seemed to sharpen when fear hung thick in the air like this. He could sense the nervous energy radiating from the horses tied along the street, their muscles twitching beneath their hides, ears constantly swiveling toward the hills where the black stallion roamed. "Mayor's called another meeting for tonight," the blacksmith replied, wiping sweat from his brow despite the morning chill. "Folks are saying we need to bring in professional hunters. This has gone on long enough." The words sent a cold spike through Tommy's chest. He'd seen what happened when men came with guns and nets, claiming they could handle what others couldn't. It never ended the way people hoped, and it certainly never ended well for the animals involved. As he continued down the street, Tommy noticed how different everything felt compared to just a week ago. The usual bustle of commerce had been replaced by an undercurrent of tension. Horses stood with their heads high and alert, riders kept tight reins, and even the town dogs seemed more skittish than usual. Near the livery stable, he spotted old Pete struggling with a particularly agitated mare, her white-rimmed eyes rolling as she fought against her lead rope. Without thinking, Tommy approached slowly, his movements fluid and unthreatening. "Easy there, girl," he murmured, though the words weren't really necessary. What mattered was the feeling he projected, calm, safe, understanding. The mare's ears flicked toward him, and gradually her dancing steps settled into stillness. Old Pete looked up in surprise. "Well, I'll be damned. She's been carrying on like that for the better part of an hour." He studied Tommy with curious eyes. "You got away with horses, boy. Your pa ever think about putting that to use?" Tommy shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "She's just scared. They all are." "Scared of that black devil, you mean?" Pete's expression darkened. "Can't say I blame them. Hell, I'm scared of him too, and I've been working with horses for 40 years. Through the stable doors, Tommy could see other horses pacing restlessly in their stalls. Their distress called to something deep inside him, a pull he'd learned to recognize but never fully understood. These weren't wild animals. They were domestic horses, bred for gentleness and cooperation with humans. Yet the stallion's presence had awakened something primal in them, something that remembered what it meant to run free across endless plains. "Pete," Tommy said carefully, "what do you know about that stallion? I mean, where did he come from?" The old man removed his hat and scratched his graying hair. Near as anyone can tell, he just appeared one day about a month back. Some say he escaped from a traveling show, others figure he's a Mustang that wandered down from the Northern Territories. But I've never seen a Mustang built like that. He's got the size and bearing of something special. Thoroughbred blood, maybe, mixed with Mustang spirit. Tommy nodded, filing away the information. In his experience, animals that appeared suddenly in places they didn't belong were usually running from something, or searching for something they'd lost. The stallion's rage might not be directed at the town at all. Millbrook might simply be in the way of whatever drove the magnificent creature. The thing that puzzles me, Pete continued, lowering his voice, is how he seems to know exactly what will cause the most trouble. Last night he spooked the Henderson horses right when they were close to the creek. Took hours to round them up in the dark, and 2 of them nearly drowned when they bolted into the water. A chill ran down Tommy's spine. That level of calculated behavior suggested intelligence far beyond what most people attributed to horses. It also suggested the stallion understood the human world well enough to know how to disrupt it effectively. As Tommy left the stable and headed home, his mind churned with possibilities. The town meeting tonight would likely result in decisions that couldn't be undone. Once professional hunters arrived, the situation would escalate beyond anyone's control. If he was going to act, it would have to be soon. The afternoon stretched before him like a challenge, and for the first time since the stallion had appeared, Tommy began to formulate a plan that didn't involve ropes, guns, or cages. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty Main Street as Jacob made his way toward the Mercantile, his boots scuffing against the weathered planks of the boardwalk. Word had spread quickly through Clearwater about his encounter with the black stallion, and he could feel the weight of curious stares following him like a persistent shadow. Mrs. Henderson emerged from her shop, flour dusting her apron, and offered him a tentative smile. "Morning, Jacob. Heard you had quite an adventure yesterday." He nodded, unsure how to respond. The truth felt too strange, too fragile to share with anyone who hadn't witnessed it themselves. "Yes, ma'am. That horse has been nothing but trouble," she continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "My Henry says you actually got close to the beast without getting trampled, says you've got some kind of magic touch." Magic. The word made Jacob's stomach tighten. He'd heard whispers about his peculiar way with animals before, but they'd always been dismissed as coincidence or luck. Now, with half the town talking about yesterday's events, those whispers were growing louder. "Just luck, I suppose," he mumbled, tipping his hat and hurrying past. But even as he said it, Jacob knew it wasn't true. What had happened with the stallion went beyond luck or coincidence. The connection he'd felt, that moment of understanding that passed between them, was something he'd experienced before with other animals, just never so intensely, never so clearly. He found Sheriff Briggs waiting by the hitching post outside the general store, his weathered face creased with worry. The older man straightened when he saw Jacob approaching. "Son, I'm glad I caught you. We need to talk." Jacob's pulse quickened. "Is something wrong, Sheriff?" "That depends." Briggs removed his hat and ran a hand through his graying hair. "The Blackwood Ranch lost 3 more horses last night. That stallion came through like a whirlwind, spooked their entire herd. 2 of their mares jumped the fence trying to follow him, and their prize breeding stud broke his leg in the chaos." The news hit Jacob like a physical blow. He thought of the intelligence he'd seen in the stallion's dark eyes, the wild freedom that seemed to radiate from every muscle and sinew. But he also thought of the ranchers who depended on their livestock for survival. "What are you asking me to do, Sheriff?" Briggs studied him carefully. "Folks are talking, Jacob, saying you might be the only one who can get close enough to that horse to do something about the situation. Some are calling for a hunting party, want to put the animal down before he ruins every ranch in the territory." "No." The word escaped Jacob's lips before he could stop it, sharp and fierce. "You can't kill him." The sheriff's eyebrows rose. "Can't or shouldn't?" Jacob felt heat creep up his neck. He's not evil, Sheriff. He's wild, yes, but he's not trying to cause harm. He's trying to be free. Freedom's a luxury we can't afford when it's costing people their livelihoods, Briggs replied, though his tone remained gentle. But I'm hoping there might be another way. Your pa mentioned you've always had a gift with animals. Maybe you could help us find a solution that doesn't end with bloodshed. The weight of expectation settled on Jakob's shoulders like a heavy yoke. He thought of his father's warnings about keeping his abilities quiet, about not drawing unwanted attention. But he also thought of the stallion's magnificent spirit and the possibility of that light being snuffed out by fear and desperation. I don't know if I can do what you're asking, Jacob said quietly. What happened yesterday? I don't fully understand it myself. Maybe not, Briggs agreed. But you're the only one who's gotten close to that horse and lived to tell about it. That has to count for something. Sheriff, Blackwood called out as he reined in his horse. We need to organize that hunting party, today. That devil horse cost me a fortune last night and I won't stand for it anymore. Now, Tom, let's not be hasty, Briggs began, but Blackwood cut him off. Hasty? I've been patient long enough. Every day we wait, that beast causes more damage. I've got men ready to ride out within the hour. Jacob felt something cold settle in his chest as he watched the determination in the rancher's eyes. Time was running out for the stallion, and somehow the responsibility for saving him was falling squarely on Jacob's young shoulders. The choice was no longer whether to use his gift, but whether he was brave enough to risk everything to save a wild horse that might not want to be saved. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street as Thomas made his way toward the saloon where the town council was meeting. Word had spread quickly about his offer to help with the stallion, and he could feel eyes following him from every doorway and window. Some gazes held curiosity, others skepticism, and a few carried the weight of desperate hope. Inside the Broken Wheel saloon, voices rose and fell in heated discussion. Thomas paused at the batwing doors, listening to the familiar arguments that had been circling for days. Mayor Hutchins was insisting they wait for professional help from the territorial capital, while Jake Morrison pounded his fist on the bar, demanding they form another hunting party. That devil horse near trampled my youngest yesterday. Morrison's voice cracked with emotion. Sarah was just trying to fetch water from the well when he came charging through like hellfire itself. If old Mrs. Chen hadn't pulled her inside, Thomas pushed through the doors, and the room fell silent. 12 men sat around mismatched tables, their weathered faces turning toward him with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the sour smell of spilled whiskey. Well, look what wandered in, sneered Clayton Webb, the town's self-appointed spokesman for those who viewed Thomas with suspicion. The half-wit thinks he can do what grown men can't. That's enough, Clayton. Doc Reeves stood from his chair near the window. The boy's here because I asked him to come, and after what I witnessed yesterday, I think we'd be fools not to listen. Mayor Hutchins adjusted his spectacles nervously. Now, Thomas, Doc tells us you have some special understanding with animals. But this isn't some stray dog we're talking about. This stallion is a killer. Thomas felt his throat tighten, the familiar anxiety of being the center of attention making his palms sweat. But beneath that discomfort, he sensed something else, a pull like an invisible thread connecting him to something wild and desperate somewhere beyond the town's borders. I know what he is, Thomas said quietly, and I know why he's angry. The room erupted in murmurs. Jake Morrison leaned forward, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and worry. Then tell us, boy. Tell us why this monster won't leave us be. Thomas closed his eyes, reaching out with that peculiar sense that had always set him apart. Even here, surrounded by the noise and skepticism of the saloon, he could feel the stallion's presence like a storm on the horizon. The horse's emotions crashed over him in waves. Rage, yes, but underneath that, something deeper, pain, loss. A grief so profound it had twisted into something destructive. He's looking for something, Thomas said, opening his eyes to find every man in the room staring at him. Someone took something from him, and he won't stop until he finds it. Clayton Webb laughed harshly. Listen to this nonsense. Next you'll be telling us the horse talks to you." But Doc Reeves was studying Thomas with the careful attention he usually reserved for difficult diagnoses. "What kind of something, son?" Thomas hesitated, knowing how it would sound. His family, his herd, they were here, but now they're gone, and he can smell their fear in this place. He thinks we took them. The silence that followed was broken by the scraping of a chair as Frank Chen, the general store owner, stood up slowly. His face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan. "Sweet Jesus," Chen whispered. "The army requisition. 3 weeks ago." Mayor Hutchins turned sharply. "What requisition, Frank?" Captain Rodriguez came through with a detail. Said they needed horses for the cavalry. Took a whole herd that had been grazing in the north pasture. Wild horses, mostly, but they were gentle enough. There was a mare with them, heavy with foal, and a couple of younger ones. The pieces fell into place like dominoes toppling. Thomas nodded grimly. "That's why he's here. That's why he won't leave. The mare was his." Jake Morrison's anger deflated into something resembling understanding. "So he's not just some rogue stallion. He's a father looking for his family," Doc Reeves finished quietly. Clayton Webb wasn't ready to accept what he was hearing. Even if that's true, it doesn't change anything. He's still dangerous. He's still threatening our children. "But it means there might be another way," Thomas said, his voice growing stronger as the certainty settled in his chest. "If I can reach him, if I can make him understand." "Understand what?" Mayor Hutchins demanded. "That his family is gone. That'll just make him angrier." Thomas shook his head. "Not gone. Taken. There's a difference. If we can find out where the army took them, maybe we can get them back, or at least get word to him about where they are." The room buzzed with new energy as the men began to grasp the possibility of a solution that didn't involve bloodshed. But Thomas barely heard their voices. His attention was focused on something else entirely, the distant sound of hoofbeats growing closer with each passing moment. The stallion was coming. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street as Thomas made his way toward the schoolhouse, his boots scuffing against the wooden planks of the boardwalk. Word had spread through Millbrook like wildfire overnight. The Anderson Ranch had lost another 3 horses to the Black Stallion's midnight raid. Mrs. Henderson clutched her shawl tighter as she hurried past, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might want to discuss the growing crisis. Thomas paused outside Brennan's general store, where a cluster of men had gathered in heated conversation. Their voices carried on the still air, fragments of frustration and fear weaving together like a storm brewing on the horizon. "Sheriff's talking about bringing in professional hunters from Denver," old Pete Morrison was saying, his weathered hands gesturing emphatically. "Says we can't afford to lose any more livestock." "Hunters won't do no good," replied Jake Brennan, leaning against his storefront. "That devil horse is smarter than any ordinary animal. It's like he knows exactly what we're thinking before we think it." Thomas felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. The weight of what he knew, what he could potentially do, pressed down on him like a physical burden. He ducked his head and continued toward school, hoping to slip by unnoticed. "Boy's got the right idea," he heard Pete mutter behind him. "Keep your head down and pray this whole nightmare passes over." Inside the one-room schoolhouse, Miss Caroline was already at her desk, but her usual cheerful demeanor seemed strained. Dark circles under her eyes suggested another sleepless night, and Thomas wondered if she'd been lying awake listening for the thunder of hooves that had become the town's recurring nightmare. As the other children filed in, their whispered conversations centered on the same topic that consumed every adult in Millbrook. Sarah Matthews claimed her father had seen the stallion standing on the ridge, overlooking their property, silhouetted against the moon like some mythical creature. Billy Patterson boasted that his uncle had gotten close enough to take a shot, though everyone knew the story grew more elaborate with each telling. Thomas took his usual seat near the back, hoping to blend into the background, but fate had other plans. Miss Caroline cleared her throat and addressed the class with an unusual announcement. "Children, I want you to know that we'll be dismissing school early today. The town council has called an emergency meeting. and they've asked that all families attend." She paused, her fingers fidgeting with the chalk in her hand. "They're going to discuss the situation and what measures need to be taken." A ripple of excitement mixed with apprehension swept through the classroom. This was the kind of grown-up drama that usually excluded children, and the prospect of being included felt both thrilling and ominous. When the shortened school day ended, Thomas found himself swept along with the crowd heading toward the town hall. The building, normally used for social gatherings and the occasional traveling show, had been transformed into a war room. Maps were spread across tables, and the air thick with tobacco smoke and tension. Sheriff Hawkins stood at the front of the room, his badge catching the light from the oil lamps. Beside him, a stranger in a city suit and polished boots commanded attention. The professional hunter from Denver, no doubt. The man's cold eyes and methodical manner suggested someone accustomed to solving problems with violence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sheriff Hawkins began, his voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd, "we've reached a point where half measures won't suffice. This animal has cost our community thousands of dollars in lost livestock and has made it unsafe for anyone to venture out after dark." The hunter stepped forward, his voice crisp and businesslike. "My name is Marcus Steele. I've tracked and eliminated problem animals from Montana to Mexico. What you're dealing with here requires a coordinated effort, multiple shooters positioned at strategic points, with bait to draw the creature into an inescapable situation." Thomas felt his chest tighten as he listened to the detailed plans for the stallion's destruction. Trap lines, crossfire patterns, backup hunters with high-powered rifles. It sounded more like a military campaign than anything else. "When do we start?" asked a voice from the crowd. "Tomorrow night," Steele replied without hesitation. "The moon will be full, giving us the visibility we need. I've studied the pattern of attacks, and I'm confident we can predict where the animal will strike next." As the meeting continued with volunteers signing up for different roles in the upcoming hunt, Thomas slipped out through the back door. The evening air felt cool against his flushed face, but it did nothing to calm the turmoil in his mind. 24 hours. That's all the time left before Millbrook's patience ran out completely and the black stallion faced an organized execution. Thomas looked up at the darkening sky, knowing that somewhere out there the magnificent creature was running free, unaware that tomorrow's sunset might be his last. The boy's gift had never felt more like a burden or more necessary. The morning sun cast long shadows across the corral as Tommy sat cross-legged in the dust, his eyes closed in concentration. The great stallion stood motionless at the far end of the enclosure, muscles rippling beneath his midnight coat, nostrils flaring with each measured breath. For 3 days now this had been their routine, a silent dance of trust and wariness that the entire town watched with bated breath. Sheriff Morrison leaned against the fence rails, his weathered hands gripping the wood until his knuckles showed white. "Boy's been sitting there for near 2 hours, he murmured to Doc Henderson, who stood beside him adjusting his spectacles against the morning glare. "Patience," the doctor replied, though his own voice carried an edge of uncertainty. "Whatever gift that child possesses, it's not something that can be rushed." Behind them, a small crowd had gathered, ranchers, shopkeepers, and children who should have been in school, but couldn't tear themselves away from the spectacle. Word had spread through Copper Ridge like wildfire about the strange boy who claimed he could communicate with the beast that had terrorized their community for weeks. Tommy felt their eyes upon him, but he pushed their doubts and expectations from his mind. Instead, he focused on the rhythm of his own heartbeat, slowing it until it matched the steady breathing of the stallion. This was how it always began, finding that shared rhythm that connected all living things. The horse's name came to him then, not in words, but in images and emotions that flooded his consciousness. Thunderwalker, a name earned through countless storms weathered in the high country, through battles fought and won against wolves and mountain lions. The stallion had been born free and had never known the touch of rope or saddle, never felt the weight of human authority. Tommy opened his eyes and met the horse's gaze, Those dark, intelligent eyes held depths of wildness that most men couldn't comprehend, and underneath something else, pain, not physical but something deeper, a loss that echoed through the animal's spirit like a bell struck in an empty cathedral. Rising slowly to his feet, Tommy took a single step forward. The stallion's ears pricked forward, alert but not aggressive. Another step. The crowd behind him fell silent, sensing that something profound was unfolding before them. "Easy, Thunder Walker," Tommy whispered, the name feeling natural on his tongue. "I know what you've lost." The images came stronger now, flowing between them like a river of shared memory. A mare, sleek and beautiful, Thunder Walker's companion for many seasons. She had been his anchor to gentleness in a harsh world, the one creature who could calm his wild spirit with nothing more than her presence. Tommy saw her final moments, the rock slide in the high canyon, the desperate attempts to reach her, the devastating solitude that followed. Thunder Walker had descended from the mountains not out of malice, but out of grief so profound it had driven him to seek something, anything that might fill the emptiness where love had once resided. His rampages through the town weren't attacks. They were cries for help from a creature that didn't know how to express his anguish any other way. Tommy moved closer, his hand extended palm up. The stallion trembled, every instinct telling him to flee or fight, but something in the boy's presence held him still. When Tommy's fingers finally touched the velvet muzzle, the horse didn't pull away. "I understand," Tommy murmured. And in that moment, he truly did. He understood the weight of loss, the fear of being truly alone in the world. His own memories surfaced, the night his parents died, the crushing realization that he was different from other children, the years of moving from one reluctant relative to another. The connection deepened, and with it came something neither boy nor horse had expected. Healing, not the magic kind found in fairy tales, but the slow, patient work of one wounded soul recognizing another. Tommy's hand moved to the stallion's neck, feeling the powerful heartbeat beneath the skin, and gradually the tension began to leave Thunder Walker's frame. Around the corral, the watching crowd held its collective breath. They couldn't understand what they were witnessing, couldn't comprehend the silent conversation taking place between species. All they could see was a small boy soothing a monster, but those with keener eyes noticed something more. The way the stallion's head dropped, the relaxation in his stance, the gradual transformation from wild terror to something approaching peace. "Well, I'll be damned," Sheriff Morrison breathed, his words barely audible. Doc Henderson nodded slowly, removing his spectacles to wipe them clean. "That boy has a gift, all right. Question is, what do we do with it?" As if hearing their words, Tommy turned toward them, his hand still resting against Thunder Walker's neck. The stallion remained calm, occasionally nuzzling the boy's shoulder with surprising gentleness. In that moment, both boy and horse looked toward an uncertain future, but for the first time in longer than either could remember, neither of them faced it alone. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street as Tommy walked toward the edge of town, his worn boots scuffing against the hard-packed earth. Behind him, the whispered conversations of early risers drifted from storefront porches, their words carrying a mixture of hope and skepticism that made his stomach churn with nervous energy. Sarah fell into step beside him, her presence a steadying force against the mounting pressure he felt pressing down on his shoulders. She carried a canvas bag filled with supplies, rope, water, and strips of dried beef that her mother had insisted might prove useful, though neither of them quite understood how. "You don't have to prove anything to them," she said quietly, glancing back at the growing cluster of townspeople who were beginning to follow at a respectful distance. Word had spread quickly through Millbrook about the boy who claimed he could communicate with the great black stallion that had brought their community to its knees. Tommy nodded, though his throat felt too tight to speak. The gift that had always felt like a natural part of him now seemed fragile and uncertain, like trying to catch moonlight in his bare hands. What if he had imagined the connection he felt with wild creatures? What if the desperate hopes of the townspeople had inflated his abilities beyond their true reach? They reached the outskirts of town, where the neat rows of houses gave way to rolling grassland dotted with mesquite and sage. The wind carried scents that spoke of freedom and wildness, earth and sky, and something indefinable that made Tommy's pulse quicken with recognition. Mayor Davidson and Sheriff Collins had taken positions near the old water tower, their faces grave as they watched the horizon through field glasses. The ranchers who had suffered losses stood in small groups, their weathered hands resting on fence posts as they scanned the distance with the practiced eyes of men who had spent their lives reading the land. "There!" Sheriff Collins called out, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. He pointed toward a ridge that rose from the prairie like the spine of some sleeping giant. Movement on the north slope. Tommy's eyes found the dark shape immediately, though it was little more than a shifting shadow against the pale grass. Even at this distance, he could feel something stirring in his chest, a recognition that ran deeper than sight or sound. The stallion moved with a fluid grace that seemed to defy the very concept of earthbound existence, his massive form flowing across the landscape like wind made flesh. The crowd pressed closer, their excitement building as the legendary horse descended toward the valley floor. Tommy could hear fragments of conversation, bets being placed, theories being shared, prayers being whispered, but the words seemed to come from somewhere far away. His entire focus had narrowed to the approaching stallion and the strange harmonics he could feel building in his mind. As the great horse drew nearer, details began to emerge that photographs and second-hand descriptions had failed to capture. The stallion's coat was not simply black, but held depths of color that shifted from obsidian to deep purple in the morning light. His mane flowed behind him like a banner of pure night, and his eyes, even from 100 yards away, seemed to burn with an intelligence that was both ancient and utterly wild. The stallion pulled up short when he caught sight of the gathered humans, his massive head rising high as he tested the wind. Tommy could feel the animal's wariness like a physical thing, a wall of suspicion and barely contained power that made his knees weak. This was no ordinary horse, no matter how extraordinary. This was something that belonged to the spaces between civilization and wilderness, a creature that carried the weight of untamed places in his very bones. "Well, boy," Mayor Davidson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There he is. What do you think?" Tommy stepped forward, separating himself from the crowd by several paces. The stallion's attention focused on him immediately, those burning eyes fixing him with a stare that seemed to look straight through to his soul. For a long moment, neither moved. The wind died to nothing, and even the usual sounds of insects and distant cattle seemed to fade into silence. Then Tommy felt it, a tentative probe against the edges of his consciousness, like fingers testing the surface of still water. The stallion was reaching out, trying to understand what manner of creature stood before him. Tommy opened his mind carefully, offering the same gentle invitation he had extended to countless wild animals over the years. The contact, when it came, nearly knocked him to his knees. This was not the simple emotional communication he shared with rabbits and hawks and deer. This was something vast and complex, a consciousness that had been shaped by years of freedom and conflict, by the endless dance between survival and dominance that defined life on the open range. The stallion took a single step forward, then another, his massive hooves barely disturbing the grass beneath them. The morning sun cast long shadows across the corral as Tommy approached the massive black stallion. Word had spread through Clearwater like wildfire. The boy who could speak to animals was finally going to face the demon horse that had terrorized their town for months. Nearly every resident had gathered along the fence rails, their faces a mixture of hope and skepticism. Sheriff Morrison stood near the gate, his hand resting nervously on his gun belt. "You sure about this, son? That beast has put 3 men in the doctor's office already." Tommy nodded, though his heart hammered against his ribs. The stallion stood at the far end of the corral, its coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the morning light. Steam rose from its nostrils in the cool air, and its dark eyes tracked Tommy's every movement with an intelligence that was almost unsettling. "Everyone needs to be quiet," Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying to every person present. He's already scared enough. Mrs. Henderson scoffed from her perch on the fence. Scared? That devil's not scared of anything. Look at the size of him. But Tommy could feel it. The trembling energy that radiated from the stallion wasn't rage or malice. It was terror, confusion, and something deeper, something that spoke of loss so profound it had driven the magnificent creature to the edge of madness. As Tommy stepped into the corral, the crowd's murmur died to absolute silence. The stallion's ears flicked forward, then back, its massive head rising as it caught the boy's scent. For a moment that stretched like eternity, horse and boy simply observed each other across the dusty ground. Then Tommy felt it, the familiar tingling sensation that started behind his eyes and spread through his consciousness. The world shifted, colors becoming more vivid while sounds grew muted. The stallion's emotions crashed over him like a wave, nearly buckling his knees with their intensity. Pain, overwhelming grief. The memory of a golden meadow where a mare with gentle eyes had grazed beside him. Foals playing in morning dew. Then men with ropes and guns, the sharp crack of rifle fire, the metallic scent of blood. Running, always running, with nowhere left to go. Tommy's own eyes filled with tears as the stallion's story unfolded in his mind. This wasn't a demon horse. This was a survivor, the last of his herd, driven by loss into a fury that he couldn't understand or control. "I know," Tommy whispered, taking a step closer. "I know what they took from you." The stallion's ears swiveled forward, his massive frame trembling. Behind Tommy, he heard someone, probably Doc Henley, quietly explaining to the crowd that they were witnessing something unprecedented. But Tommy barely registered the words. His entire focus was on the broken creature before him. "My name is Tommy," he continued, his voice soft but clear. "I lost someone too, my pa. He's not coming back, just like they're not coming back." Another step. The stallion didn't retreat, but his muscles coiled like springs, ready to explode into violence. Tommy could feel the war raging inside the animal, the desperate need for connection battling against the pain that had taught him to trust nothing and no one. "You don't have to be alone anymore," Tommy said, extending his hand palm up. "I know it hurts. I know you think it'll always hurt. But staying angry won't bring them back." The stallion snorted, pawing the ground with one massive hoof. Dust swirled between them, caught by a morning breeze that carried the scent of sage and distant rain. Tommy felt the animal's resistance weakening, years of grief and rage beginning to crack like ice in spring sun. "I see you," Tommy said, his voice breaking slightly. "Not the monster they think you are. I see the horse who protected his family, who loved them, who's been carrying all that love with nowhere to put it." The stallion took a step forward, then another. His great head lowered until he was eye level with the boy, and Tommy could see his own reflection in those dark depths. But more than that, he could see the stallion seeing him in return. "That's it," Tommy breathed, reaching out slowly until his fingertips brushed the velvet soft nose. The contact sent a shockwave of emotion through both of them. Recognition, understanding, the first tentative threads of trust. Behind him, Tommy heard someone gasp, then the rustle of movement as the entire crowd leaned forward. But the sounds seemed to come from very far away. In this moment, there was only boy and horse, two wounded souls finding solace in shared understanding. The stallion's breathing slowed, his massive frame relaxing for the first time in months. Tommy pressed his forehead against the horse's nose, feeling the warm breath against his skin. "We're going to be okay," he whispered, and for the first time since his father's death, Tommy actually believed it might be true. The morning sun cast long shadows across the makeshift corral as Jacob approached the towering black stallion. His bare feet made no sound on the packed earth, and his breathing had settled into the deep, rhythmic pattern that always preceded his connections with wild creatures. The horse stood motionless in the center of the enclosure, its dark eyes fixed on the boy with an intensity that made the gathered townspeople hold their breath. Sheriff Morrison gripped the fence rail so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "Easy, son," he whispered, though Jacob was already beyond hearing human words. The boy's consciousness had begun to drift, reaching out like invisible tendrils toward the stallion's mind. What Jacob found there nearly knocked him backward. The horse's thoughts weren't just wild, they were fractured, filled with a rage so pure and consuming it felt like touching molten steel. Images flashed through the connection, men with ropes and whips, the crack of gunfire, the taste of blood in mountain snow. But beneath the fury lay something else, something that made Jacob's heart clench with sudden understanding. Pain. Deep, unrelenting pain that had nothing to do with physical wounds. The stallion's ears flicked forward as Jacob took another step closer. Through their growing connection, the boy sensed the horse's confusion. This small human felt different from the others. There was no fierce stench, no aggression, no desire to dominate. Instead, Jacob projected calm acceptance, the same feeling a foal might sense from its mother. "He's not just angry," Jacob said softly, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "He's grieving." Dr. Whitmore leaned forward against the fence. "Grieving? What do you mean?" Jacob's eyes remained locked on the stallion as more images flooded through their connection. A smaller horse, graceful and swift, with a coat the color of autumn leaves. The two horses running together across endless meadows, their movements perfectly synchronized. Then came darker visions, the mare trapped in a canyon, men closing in with nets, her desperate screams echoing off stone walls. "He had a mate," Jacob whispered. "She was captured. He's been searching for her." The revelation rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Martha Henderson pressed her hand to her throat, and even Tom Brennan's perpetual scowl softened slightly. The stallion pawed the ground once, a sound like thunder, but his posture had changed. The rigid tension in his neck had eased, and his breathing had deepened. Jacob continued his approach, one careful step at a time. The horse's pain washed over him in waves, nearly overwhelming in its intensity. Years of searching, of following human settlements and raiding ranches, driven not by malice but by desperate hope. Every brown mare he'd seen from a distance might have been her. Every time disappointment followed, the rage grew stronger. "Where did they take her?" Jacob asked, not with his voice but through the strange telepathic link they now shared. The stallion's response came as a flood of fragmented memories. Men in blue uniforms, wagons heading east, the sound of a train whistle in the distance. The scent trail growing cold at the edge of a great river. Then nothing but endless, futile searching and the slow transformation of hope into fury. Jacob was close enough now to see his own reflection in the horse's dark eyes. The stallion stood nearly 18 hands high, his shoulders level with the boy's head, every muscle defined beneath the midnight black coat. At this distance, the sheer power of the animal was overwhelming. One strike from those hooves could end Jacob's life in an instant. Instead, the great head lowered slowly until the stallion's muzzle was inches from Jacob's face. Their breathing synchronized, and the boy felt the last of the horse's defensive barriers crumble away. What remained was raw, aching loneliness, and a spirit worn nearly to breaking by years of solitary wandering. Jacob raised his hand and placed it gently on the stallion's neck. The contact sent a shock through both of them, not painful, but electric with possibility. Through their link, Jacob shared memories of his own, the feeling of belonging he'd found with Sam and Elena, the warmth of acceptance from this community that had taken him in. He offered the stallion something the horse had forgotten existed, the promise that he didn't have to carry his grief alone. The change was visible to everyone watching. The stallion's rigid stance relaxed, and a sound somewhere between a sigh and a rumble emerged from his chest. For the first time since arriving in Willow Creek, the great horse looked not like a force of destruction, but like what he truly was, a magnificent creature shaped by loss into something fearsome. "He's been running from his pain," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion. But running only made it stronger. Sheriff Morrison wiped sweat from his brow despite the morning chill. Can you calm him?" Jacob nodded slowly, never breaking eye contact with the stallion. "I think so, but it's going to take time. He needs to learn to trust again." The boy paused, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. And he needs to find a new purpose. The morning sun cast long shadows across the makeshift corral as Samuel stood at the fence line, his small hands gripping the weathered wood. The black stallion paced restlessly in the center of the enclosure, its muscles rippling beneath its dark coat like storm clouds gathering strength. Every few steps, the magnificent beast would pause and fix Samuel with an intense stare that seemed to pierce straight through to his soul. "You sure about this, boy?" Sheriff Hawkins asked, his voice heavy with concern. Behind him, nearly the entire town had gathered, their faces a mixture of hope and dread. Samuel could feel their collective anxiety pressing against his consciousness like a physical weight. Samuel nodded slowly, though his throat felt dry as dust. "He's been calling to me all night," he whispered. "In my dreams, in the spaces between sleeping and waking. He wants something, but it's different than before." The boy climbed over the fence with careful, deliberate movements. The stallion's head snapped toward him immediately, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. Samuel could feel the animal's wildness washing over him in waves. Not the mindless rage he'd sensed during the attacks on the town, but something far more complex. Pain, loneliness, a desperate, aching need that cut deeper than any physical wound. "Easy," Samuel murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the horse or to himself. He took a tentative step forward, his bare feet silent on the packed earth. The stallion snorted and backed away, tossing its magnificent head, but it didn't charge. Instead, it seemed to be studying him with the same intensity that Samuel was studying it. As the distance between them closed, Samuel's gift began to work more clearly. Images flashed through his mind, fragmented memories that belonged to the great horse, a vast prairie stretching endlessly under an open sky, the thundering hooves of a herd racing across sun-baked earth, and then separation, capture. The slow, crushing realization that freedom was gone forever. "You weren't born to hurt people," Samuel said softly, taking another careful step. "You were born to run." The stallion's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, and for a moment the animal stood perfectly still. Samuel could feel something shifting in the space between them, like a door slowly creaking open after being locked for years. Behind him, he heard Ma Hutchins gasp. "Look at that," she breathed. "He's listening to the boy." But Samuel barely heard her. His entire focus was consumed by the magnificent creature before him, by the flood of emotions and memories that poured through their growing connection. He saw flashes of the stallion's recent rampages through town, but now he understood them differently. Each attack had been born not from malice, but from a desperate attempt to break free from invisible chains, the chains of captivity, of being separated from everything that had given his life meaning. "You miss them," Samuel said, his voice stronger now. "Your family, your herd." The words came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, drawn from the wellspring of understanding that flowed between them. "You think if you fight hard enough, somehow you'll find your way back to them." The stallion took a step forward, then another. Its dark eyes never left Samuel's face, and the boy could feel the animal's surprise at being truly understood, perhaps for the first time since its capture. Slowly, carefully, Samuel extended his hand. The horse stretched its neck forward, nostrils flaring as it caught his scent. For a heartbeat that seemed to last forever, they remained frozen in that position. Boy and beast, two souls recognizing something kindred in each other despite the vast differences in their forms. Then, with infinite gentleness, the stallion's velvet muzzle brushed against Samuel's palm. The contact sent a shock of pure connection through Samuel's entire being. Suddenly, he wasn't just sensing the horse's emotions, he was experiencing them as if they were his own. The crushing weight of loneliness, the burning need for freedom, the confusion and anger at being trapped in a world that made no sense. But underneath it all, Samuel felt something else, a deep, abiding gentleness that had been buried beneath layers of pain and fear. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," Samuel whispered, his other hand slowly rising to touch the stallion's neck. The horse trembled beneath his touch but didn't pull away. "I understand what you need." The crowd behind them had fallen completely silent, as if they sensed they were witnessing something profound and fragile that could be shattered by the slightest disturbance. Samuel could feel their amazement, their hope, but he pushed those sensations aside to focus entirely on the magnificent creature before him. For the first time in weeks, the stallion's mental voice carried no trace of rage or desperation. Instead, Samuel heard something that made his heart clench with empathy, a simple, wordless plea for understanding, for connection, for someone to see past the fury to the wounded soul beneath. "I see you," Samuel said simply, "and I know what we have to do." The first light of dawn painted the mountains in shades of amber and gold as Samuel made his way to the makeshift corral they'd built at the edge of town. His boots crunched softly on the frost-covered ground, each step deliberate and measured. Behind him, the entire population of Cedar Ridge followed at a respectful distance, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and terror. The great black stallion stood motionless in the center of the enclosure, his magnificent head raised high, nostrils flaring as he tested the morning air. Even contained, he radiated an aura of barely controlled power that made the sturdy wooden posts seem fragile as matchsticks. His coat gleamed like polished obsidian in the early light, and his dark eyes held depths that spoke of ancient wildness and untold stories of the frontier. Samuel approached the fence slowly, his hands empty and visible. The conversations behind him faded to whispers, then to complete silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The boy had spent the entire night preparing for this moment, not through planning or strategy, but through a deep meditation that his grandmother had taught him years ago, a way of emptying himself of fear and doubt until only pure intention remained. The stallion's ears swiveled forward as Samuel reached the fence, those intelligent eyes fixed on the boy with an intensity that would have sent most grown men scrambling for safety. But Samuel felt no fear, only a profound sense of recognition, as if he were looking at a reflection of something wild and free that lived within his own soul. "I know what you are," Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. "You're not just angry. You're protecting something." The stallion snorted, a sound like distant thunder, and took a step closer to the fence. His massive hooves left deep impressions in the packed earth, and the wooden rails creaked under the weight of his presence. Samuel could feel the collective intake of breath from the crowd behind him, but he kept his focus entirely on the magnificent creature before him. Closing his eyes, Samuel reached out with that strange gift that had always set him apart from others. It wasn't something he could easily explain, not a voice or a vision, but rather a current of understanding that flowed between him and the creatures of the wild. With horses, it was strongest of all, as if they spoke a language his heart had always known. Images began to form in his mind, a hidden valley deep in the mountains, where wild horses ran free under endless skies. A beautiful mare with a coat like burnished copper, heavy with foal. Men with ropes and cruel intentions, driving the herd toward a narrow canyon where escape would be impossible. The stallion's desperate charge to protect his family, his mate's terrified scream as the walls closed in around them. Samuel's eyes snapped open, and he saw the pain reflected in the great horse's gaze. "They took her from you," he said softly. "Your mate. That's why you came to town. That's why you won't leave." The stallion's entire body trembled, and for a moment the wild fury that had terrorized Cedar Ridge cracked open to reveal a grief so profound it took Samuel's breath away. The horse had been searching, hoping against hope that she might have escaped, that he might find some trace of her among the domestic horses in the town's corrals. Moving with infinite care, Samuel climbed over the fence and dropped into the enclosure. Gasps and urgent whispers erupted from the crowd, but he paid them no attention. His entire world had narrowed to this moment, this connection with a creature whose heart had been shattered by loss. The stallion could have crushed him with a single blow, could have ended his life in an instant. Instead, The great horse stood perfectly still as Samuel approached, step by careful step. When the boy was close enough to feel the warmth radiating from the stallion's powerful body, he stopped and simply stood there, sharing the silence and the sorrow. "I can't bring her back," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I can promise you this, her memory will live on. In you, in the stories we tell, in the respect we show to all the wild things that still run free in these mountains." The stallion lowered his massive head until his breath warmed Samuel's face. For a long moment, they stood together in perfect stillness, boy and beast united by an understanding that transcended words. Then, with movements as gentle as whispers, Samuel raised his hand and placed it against the stallion's neck. The connection that flowed between them in that instant was electric, transformative. Samuel felt the horse's pain as his own, but also his strength, his nobility, his fierce love for the lost mare. And perhaps, just perhaps, the stallion felt something of the boy's compassion in return. The storm clouds gathered thick and black above the mesa as Samuel led Tempest down the winding trail toward Clearwater. The great stallion moved with newfound trust, his massive hooves finding careful purchase on the rocky path. Behind them, Doc Morrison rode his bay gelding, medical bag secured tightly to his saddle, while Jake Henderson brought up the rear on his paint mare. "Boy's got a gift like nothing I ever seen," Jake muttered to the doctor, his weathered face creased with wonder. "That horse was pure devil incarnate just yesterday." Doc Morrison nodded, adjusting his spectacles against the rising wind. "There's more to young Samuel than meets the eye, that's certain. But the real test comes when we reach town." As if summoned by his words, the first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy against the dusty earth. Tempest's ears flicked nervously at the approaching thunder, but Samuel's gentle hand on his neck kept him steady. The boy had learned to feel the stallion's emotions like ripples in still water, every fear, every surge of wild instinct that threatened to break free. "Easy, friend," Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "We're almost home." The word felt strange on his tongue. Home. For so long, Samuel had been drifting from place to place with his father, never settling long enough to call anywhere home. But something about Clearwater, about these people who had shown him kindness despite their fear, felt different. They crested the final ridge as the storm broke in earnest. Below them, the town of Clearwater spread out like a promise of shelter, warm lights glowing in windows despite the early evening hour, but Samuel could see the changes his absence had wrought. Fences stood newly repaired, shops bore fresh boards over broken windows, and clusters of people moved through the streets with the careful vigilance of those who had seen real danger. "Look there," Doc Morrison called out, pointing toward the main street. Half the town's turned out. Indeed, despite the driving rain, dozens of townspeople had gathered under awnings and in doorways, watching their approach with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Samuel felt Tempest tense beneath him as they descended toward the crowd, the stallion's nostrils flaring at the scent of so many humans. Sheriff Garrett emerged from the jailhouse, his hand resting on his gun belt out of habit rather than threat. Behind him came Mayor Hutchins, Mayor's wife Sarah, and a dozen others Samuel recognized from his brief time in town. Their faces showed the strain of recent days, the fear, the sleepless nights, the weight of not knowing when terror might strike again. "Samuel," Sheriff Garrett called out as they drew near. "That really him? That really the Black Devil?" The boy dismounted slowly, keeping one hand on Tempest's neck. The stallion stood nearly 17 hands high, his coat glistening like polished obsidian in the rain. Every person in that street could see the raw power contained within those muscles, the wild fire that still burned behind those dark eyes. Martha Henley stepped forward from the crowd, her face pale but determined. "My little Annie. She ain't spoke a word since that day he trampled our garden. Keeps having nightmares about those hooves." Samuel felt Tempest's confusion through their connection, the stallion's bewilderment at the fear he sensed in these creatures, who seemed so much like the gentle boy who had befriended him. He didn't understand, Samuel explained, looking directly at Martha. All he knew was that he was trapped, surrounded by noise and threats. He was just trying to get free. And now? Sheriff Garrett's voice carried a note of challenge. What's to stop him from going wild again? For answer, Samuel pressed his palm against Tempest's forehead. The connection flowed between them like a river finding its course. Trust earned through patience, understanding built through shared silence, and something deeper that transcended the barrier between human and animal. The stallion lowered his great head, breathing softly against Samuel's chest. He chooses to stay gentle, the boy said. Same way we all choose, every day, whether to let our wildness rule us or find a better way. The crowd stirred uneasily. Some faces showed dawning comprehension, others remained skeptical. But young Annie Henley broke free from her mother's grip and took 3 small steps toward the massive horse. "Annie, no!" Martha cried out. But Samuel was already kneeling beside the girl, his hands still maintaining contact with Tempest. "It's all right," he whispered to both horse and child. "She just wants to understand." Annie reached out one tiny finger and touched the stallion's velvet nose. Tempest remained perfectly still, and for the first time since that terrible day, the little girl smiled. Thunder crashed overhead, but in that moment, something shifted in the air between the boy, the horse, and the town that watched them both. The wind carried the scent of rain across the dusty street as Thomas stood in the growing crowd outside Doc Morrison's office. Word had spread quickly through Clearwater about the boy who'd tamed the devil horse, and now it seemed half the town had gathered to catch a glimpse of the mysterious child who'd accomplished the impossible. "Let the boy through," Sheriff Hawkins called out, his weathered hand resting protectively on Thomas's shoulder. The crowd parted reluctantly, whispers following their path like autumn leaves. Inside the cramped office, Doc Morrison looked up from cleaning his instruments, his usually stern expression softening when he saw Thomas. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, then caught himself. "Pardon my language, son, but what you did out there, I've been doctoring folks in this territory for 20 years, and I ain't never seen anything like it." Thomas shifted uncomfortably under the attention. Through the window, he could see Tempest grazing peacefully in the makeshift corral they'd built behind the saloon. The great stallion's presence felt like a warm current in the back of his mind, steady and reassuring. "Doc," Sheriff Hawkins said, removing his hat. "The boy's been through a lot. His well, that horse trampled him something fierce yesterday." Dr. Morrison's face grew serious. "How's he holding up?" "Stable, but barely conscious. Thomas here hasn't left his side except to come deal with the stallion." Thomas found his voice, though it came out smaller than he intended. "Is he going to be all right?" The doctor's pause stretched too long. "Your father's a strong man, son, but his injuries, there's internal damage, broken ribs, possible bleeding. I've done what I can, but the next few days will tell us everything." A heavy silence settled over the room. Outside, Thomas could hear the murmur of voices, people discussing what they'd witnessed. Some called it a miracle. Others whispered darker theories about witchcraft and unnatural powers. "There's something else," Sheriff Hawkins said, his voice dropping. "Mayor Caldwell's been asking questions about the boy, about how he knew to handle that horse. Some folks are getting spooked." "Spooked?" Dr. Morrison's eyebrows raised. "The child just saved this town from a menace that killed 3 people and injured a dozen more. What's there to be spooked about?" Thomas felt a familiar chill run down his spine. He'd sensed this fear before, in other towns, other places where his gift had revealed itself. People celebrated miracles until they had time to think about them, to realize that what seemed impossible might mean something they couldn't understand or control. "Can I see my pa now?" he asked quietly. Dr. Morrison nodded, leading them to a small room in the back. Thomas's father lay motionless on a narrow cot, his face pale and drawn, bandages wrapped around his chest. The sight hit Thomas like a physical blow. "Pa?" he whispered, taking the man's calloused hand in his own small fingers. His father's eyes fluttered open, focusing with effort. "Thomas, Did I dream it, or did you really—" "The horse is safe, Pa. He's not angry anymore." A weak smile crossed his father's face. "I always knew you were special, son. Your mother, she used to say you had a gift with creatures. Said it reminded her of her grandfather back in the old country." Thomas had never heard this story before. "What do you mean?" "Stories about people who could speak to animals, calm the wildest beasts. I thought they were just tales until I saw you with that injured hawk when you were 7. His father's breathing was labored, each word an effort. "But Thomas, you need to be careful. People fear what they don't understand." As if summoned by his father's warning, Mayor Caldwell's voice boomed from the front office. "I demand to speak with the boy. The town council has questions." Sheriff Hawkins stepped into the doorway, blocking the mayor's advance. "The child is with his injured father. Your questions can wait." "Wait?" Caldwell's face was flushed with indignation. "Do you have any idea what people are saying? They're claiming the boy used dark magic, that he's in league with demons. I've got families talking about leaving town because they're afraid." Thomas felt Tempest's distress through their connection. The stallion could sense the tension, the fear and anger radiating from the gathered crowd. The magnificent animal pawed the ground nervously, his earlier calm beginning to fracture. "I should go to him," Thomas said, rising from his father's bedside. "No." His father gripped his hand with surprising strength. "You listen to me, son. Some gifts come with a price. But don't ever let fear make you hide who you are. This town needed you, and you answered that call." Dr. Morrison appeared in the doorway, his face grim. "Sheriff, you'd better come see this. The crowd outside, it's getting ugly." Through the window, Thomas could see people gathering in the street, their voices rising in heated debate. Some defended him, but others shouted accusations and demands. And in the corral, Tempest raised his great head toward the sky, sensing the storm that was about to break over them all. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Jesse walked slowly toward the center of town, his heart hammering against his ribs. Word had spread like wildfire through Copper Ridge overnight. The boy would face the black stallion at dawn. Now, as the first rays of light painted the mountains gold, it seemed like every soul in the territory had gathered to witness what might be his final moments. Sheriff Morrison stood at the edge of the crowd, his weathered face etched with worry. Mrs. Henderson clutched her shawl tightly, while Doc Patterson nervously adjusted his spectacles. Even the children who had once mocked Jesse now watched in hushed reverence, sensing the gravity of what was about to unfold. Jesse's father stepped forward, his calloused hand finding his son's shoulder. "You don't have to do this, boy. There ain't no shame in walking away." But Jesse shook his head, his eyes already scanning the horizon for signs of the beast. "Yes, I do, Pa. This is what I was meant for. I can feel it." A low rumble echoed across the valley, not thunder but hoofbeats. The crowd instinctively stepped back as a black shape materialized on the ridge above town. The stallion stood silhouetted against the brightening sky, magnificent and terrible, his mane flowing like dark water in the morning breeze. Even at this distance, his eyes blazed with an intelligence that seemed almost supernatural. Jesse walked forward alone, leaving the safety of the crowd behind. Each step felt like a small eternity. The connection he'd always felt with animals thrummed stronger now, but this creature was different from any he'd encountered. There was pain here, deep primal hurt that had festered into rage. The stallion began his descent, moving with fluid grace despite his massive size. Dust rose in clouds behind him, and the ground seemed to shake with each stride. Jesse could hear Mrs. Henderson's sharp intake of breath, could sense the collective fear rippling through the gathered townspeople. But he pressed on, his bare feet steady on the packed earth. When they were 50 yards apart, both boy and horse stopped. The stallion's nostrils flared, steam rising in the cool air. His powerful muscles bunched and relaxed, ready to charge or flee. Jesse could feel the creature's confusion. This small human showed no fear, carried no rope or weapon, made no sudden movements. "I know," Jesse whispered. though his voice somehow carried across the distance between them. "I know what they did to you." The stallion's ears twitched forward, and for a moment the rage in his eyes flickered. Jesse took another step closer, and another. With each movement, he opened his mind wider, letting the gift his grandmother had recognized flow freely for the first time in his life. Images flooded his consciousness, memories not his own. A younger stallion running free across endless plains, the sharp crack of rifles, the fall of his mare, heavy with foal, the burn of ropes around his neck, the cruel bite of spurs and the sting of whips from men who sought to break something that was never meant to be broken. Tears streamed down Jesse's face as he absorbed the horse's anguish. The stallion's entire being vibrated with loss and betrayal, with a hurt so deep it had transformed into something monstrous. No wonder he'd brought terror to the valley. He was a creature driven mad by grief. "I'm sorry," Jesse said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry for what they did. But this isn't the way. This pain you're carrying, it's eating you alive." The stallion trembled, caught between the urge to destroy this human, as he had the others, and something else, a recognition of understanding, of communion he'd never experienced with any two-legged creature. The moment their skin met, the connection exploded between them. Jesse felt the stallion's strength flowing into him, while his own calm radiated outward, soothing the savage pain that had driven the creature to madness. It was as if two broken pieces had found each other and discovered they fit together perfectly. Behind them, the crowd watched in stunned silence as the boy they'd dismissed as strange worked a miracle none of them could have imagined. The black stallion, the terror of Copper Ridge, the demon that had haunted their nightmares, stood docile as a lamb beneath Jesse's gentle touch. But Jesse knew this was only the beginning. Healing this depth of trauma would take time, patience, and a bond stronger than anything he'd ever attempted to forge. As the sun climbed higher, casting its warm light over the transformed scene, he began to whisper soft words of comfort to the broken creature before him. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street as the entire town gathered in tense silence. Every face showed the same mixture of fear and desperate hope that had been building for weeks. The great black stallion stood at the far end of the street, his massive frame silhouetted against the rising light, steam rising from his nostrils in the cool air. Tommy walked slowly toward the center of the street, his bare feet making no sound on the packed earth. Behind him, he could hear whispered prayers and stifled sobs from the crowd that had pressed against storefronts and doorways. Sheriff Morrison stood with his hand resting on his holster, though they all knew bullets had proven useless against this creature that seemed more legend than flesh. The stallion's eyes fixed on Tommy, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, neither moved. Those dark eyes held intelligence far beyond any ordinary horse, and something else, a wildness so pure and untamed that it made Tommy's chest tighten with understanding. This wasn't just a dangerous animal, this was freedom itself, trapped and angry in a world that sought to cage everything wild. Tommy's gift stirred within him, that strange connection he'd never fully understood until now. It wasn't about controlling animals or bending them to his will. It was about seeing the world through their eyes, feeling their hearts beat in rhythm with his own. As he reached out with that inner sense, he felt the stallion's pain, not physical but deeper. The loneliness of being the last of his kind, the fury at being hunted, the desperate need to run free across endless plains. "I know," Tommy whispered, though he was still 50 yards away. "I know what they've done to you." The stallion's ears flicked forward at the sound, and his great head lifted slightly. Around them, the town held its collective breath. Tommy continued walking, each step measured and careful. He could feel the stallion's emotions like waves crashing against his consciousness. Rage, sorrow, and underneath it all, a terrible exhaustion. This magnificent creature had been fighting for so long that he'd forgotten what peace felt like. When Tommy was 20 yards away, the stallion suddenly reared up, his hooves striking the air like weapons. Several people in the crowd screamed, but Tommy didn't flinch. Instead, he sat down cross-legged in the dust, making himself small and unthreatening. The stallion landed heavily, snorting and pawing the ground, but his eyes never left the boy. "They killed your family," Tommy said softly, the knowledge flowing through their connection like water, finding its level. "The other horses in your herd. That's why you came here. That's why you're so angry." The stallion's massive body trembled, and Tommy felt the grief that the creature had been carrying like a physical weight. Images flashed through their shared consciousness, a peaceful valley where wild horses had roamed for generations, the sound of gunfire, the smell of smoke, the stallion running alone through empty grassland where his family once grazed. Tommy's own eyes filled with tears as he absorbed the stallion's pain. He understood now why the creature had terrorized the town, why he'd fought so viciously against every attempt to capture him. It wasn't mindless destruction, it was the rage of a soul that had lost everything. "I'm sorry," Tommy whispered, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "I'm so sorry for what they took from you." The stallion took a step closer, then another. His ears were no longer pinned back in aggression, and the wild fire in his eyes had dimmed to something softer, more questioning. Tommy remained perfectly still, letting the animal approach at his own pace. When the great head lowered to within arm's reach, Tommy slowly extended his hand. The stallion's breath was warm against his palm as the creature sniffed cautiously, then pressed his muzzle gently against the boy's fingers. The contact sent a jolt through Tommy's gift, and suddenly he could feel everything. The stallion's massive heart beating like thunder, the coiled power in every muscle, the intelligence that burned bright as any human mind. But more than that, he felt the creature's need, not for vengeance or destruction, but for understanding, for someone to acknowledge what he had lost and honor the memory of his fallen herd. Tommy stood slowly, his hand never leaving the stallion's face. Around them, the town watched in amazement as the most dangerous creature any of them had ever seen stood docile as a lamb, his eyes fixed on the small boy who had somehow reached past all that rage to touch something deeper. "You don't have to be alone anymore," Tommy said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness. "And you don't have to fight anymore either. I understand what you need." The stallion nickered softly, a sound unlike any he had made since arriving in town. It was almost gentle, almost hopeful. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street as Jesse walked toward the center of town, his bare feet silent on the packed earth. Behind him, the entire population of Clearwater had gathered. Ranchers, shopkeepers, women clutching children, old-timers who'd seen everything the frontier could offer. But none had seen anything like this. The black stallion stood magnificent and terrible in the town square, his coat gleaming like polished obsidian. Steam rose from his nostrils in the cool morning air, and his eyes held the wild fire of untamed lightning. He'd trampled through 3 ranches, destroyed property worth thousands of dollars, and injured half a dozen men who'd tried to rope him. The Winchester rifles trained on him from windows and doorways remained steady, fingers hovering over triggers, waiting for the word that would end this standoff in blood. Jesse stopped 30 feet from the stallion and slowly sank to his knees in the dirt. He closed his eyes, feeling for that familiar current that had always flowed between him and the creatures of the wild. It was there, humming like electricity in the space between heartbeats. But something was different. The stallion's mind burned with more than wildness. It pulsed with pain. "Easy, boy," Jesse whispered, though his voice carried impossibly clear in the morning stillness. "I know you're hurting." The stallion's ears flicked forward, those dark eyes fixed on the small figure kneeling before him, and for the first time in days, the great beast stood perfectly still. Jesse opened his eyes and began to rise, moving with the fluid grace of someone who belonged to the natural world rather than the civilized one. Each step brought him closer to the stallion, and with each step, he felt the animal's story unfolding in his mind, like pages turning in a book written in wind and starlight. Captured as a yearling, broken by men with whips and spurs who mistook cruelty for mastery. Years of fighting, of being beaten down and caged, until something inside snapped, The stallion had killed his last captor and fled into the wilderness, carrying wounds deeper than flesh, wounds that had festered in his spirit until trust became impossible and rage became his only companion. "They hurt you," Jesse said, now close enough to see the faded scars beneath the stallion's coat. "They tried to break something that was never meant to be broken." The stallion's nostrils flared, but he didn't retreat. Jesse extended his hand, palm up, and the current between them strengthened. Images flowed both ways now. Jesse sharing memories of running wild with wolves, of soaring on eagle wings, of swimming with salmon upstream toward home. The stallion's breathing slowed. Behind them, the town held its collective breath. Sheriff Morrison's hand remained steady on his rifle, but his finger had moved away from the trigger. Even he could sense that something extraordinary was happening. "I won't try to tame you," Jesse continued, his hand now inches from the stallion's muzzle. "That's not what this is about. You've got every right to be wild, every right to run free. But the hurting, that's what's driving you to hurt others, and that's got to stop." The stallion lowered his great head, and Jesse's fingertips brushed the velvet softness of his nose. The connection blazed to life, and suddenly Jesse was experiencing the world through the stallion's senses, feeling the incredible power coiled in those muscles, the wind hunger that called him toward distant mountains, the loneliness that came from years of solitude. But Jesse shared something else through their bond, the possibility of peace without surrender, of healing without captivity. He showed the stallion the high country to the north, where streams ran clear and grass grew thick, where a horse could run for days without seeing a fence or hearing a human voice. The stallion raised his head, looking toward the mountains that rose blue and distant beyond the town's edge. When he looked back at Jesse, the fire in his eyes had changed from rage to something approaching hope. Jesse stepped back, his hand falling to his side. "Go on," he said softly. "Go home." The stallion reared once, his hooves flashing silver in the sunlight, and trumpeted a call that echoed off the surrounding hills. Then he wheeled and galloped down the main street, past the silent crowd, past the town limits, toward the open country beyond. The sound of his hoofbeats faded into the distance, but no one moved. They stood transfixed, watching the small boy who had accomplished what no rope or rifle could manage. Jesse turned to face them, and for a moment his eyes still held something of the wild, ancient and knowing and utterly free. Sheriff Morrison was the first to lower his weapon. Then the others followed, understanding instinctively that they had witnessed something that would become legend, something their grandchildren would struggle to believe. The stallion was gone, carrying his pain toward healing in the high country where he belonged, and the boy who had saved them all stood quietly in the morning light, already fading back into the simple, ordinary world that would never quite contain him again.